Hello everyone, and welcome to our final Trail Went Cold episode of 2025. I'm your host Robin Warder, and yes, it's that time again, as our podcast is now dropping our 7th special update episode. 2 months from now, the Trail Went Cold will reach the magic milestone of hitting our 10th anniversary as a podcast, and of course, when I first started this show back in 2016, I never dreamed that so many of our featured cases would get solved that we wind up having enough material for 7 update episodes. There were some pretty major updates this year, which we're going to discuss momentarily, and we also experienced a podcast first back in November when I released episode number 456 about the 1984 murder of 16-year-old Teresa Fusco. Long story short, a suspect named Richard Bellotto wound up being arrested for the crime while I was in the midst of working on the episode, but I still decided to complete it and release it anyway with the updated information. Of course, this resolution came about when genetic genealogy linked DNA evidence to a suspect who had never been on the radar before, and this whole situation pretty much demonstrated that even cold cases that are decades old can still be solved, which is why I have no doubt that we'll be releasing many more special update episodes in the future. Anyway, before we get started, I should mention that this episode will focus exclusively on cases which have had updates in 2025, so if you'd like to hear about cases which have been resolved or had major developments before this year, I'd recommend going back and listening to our previous updates on episodes number 155, 257, 310, 359, 369, and 412. But 2025 was a pretty huge year when it came to updates, so we're going to have a lot to talk about here. So without any further ado, let us now begin the Trail Went Cold 7th special update episode. Cue the vintage old school Unsolved Mysteries update music. So it's only appropriate that we start off by discussing my personal number one passion case, and that's the controversial conviction of Tommy Zeigler, which I covered in a 2-part series all the way back on episodes number 15 and 16. In case you need a brief recap, 50 years ago, on Christmas Eve in 1975, Tommy Zeigler was charged for the murders of 4 victims: his wife, Eunice Zeigler, her parents, Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a man named Charlie Mays. All 4 victims were shot to death at the Zeigler family's furniture store in Winter Garden, Florida, and Perry Edwards and Charlie Mays were also bludgeoned with a metal linoleum crank, which was found at the scene. Tommy has always maintained that he was attacked by multiple intruders when he walked inside the dark store before he was shot and passed out, but even though he had a gunshot wound in his abdomen, the authorities believed that it was self-inflicted and that Tommy staged the whole thing and committed all 4 of the murders himself. Since Charlie Mays was known for being a regular customer at the furniture store, investigators suspected that Tommy lured him there after closing in order to kill him and frame him for the murders of his wife and in-laws. However, Tommy's supporters suspect that Charlie Mays was a perpetrator rather than a victim, and that he and some accomplices killed Eunice, Perry, and Virginia before they attacked Tommy. Before he lost consciousness, Tommy claimed that he managed to grab a gun from his desk drawer and fired off a few shots in self-defense, and he believes that he may have wounded Mays and prompted his accomplices to finish the job by bludgeoning him with the crank because they knew they couldn't take Mays to a hospital. Well, after he was found guilty at trial, Tommy was sentenced to death, but because of the controversial nature of this case, his execution has never gone through, and I believe he currently holds the American record for the longest amount of time that an inmate has ever spent on death row, as he has been incarcerated at Florida State Prison for 49.5 years and is currently 80 years old. Over the past 2 decades, Tommy's defense team has filed numerous motions requesting advanced DNA testing, which have been rejected by the state of Florida, but in 2021, Monique Worrell, the newly elected state attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida, finally agreed to authorize it. Naturally, there was still a lot of resistance and legal wrangling from the state, so it would be another few years before the testing was finally completed. But on January the 18th of this past year, Leonora Lapeter Anton, an investigative journalist who has provided a ton of coverage of the case, published an article in the Tampa Bay Times under the headline, quote, long-awaited DNA analysis proved Zeigler innocent in 1975 murders, lawyers say. End quote. Now, obviously, since Tommy was present at the furniture store on the night of the crime, his DNA was always going to be at the murder scene, so it would require some very specialized testing to prove he was not personally responsible for the murders. Tommy's defense team had 43 items of evidence shipped to the Forensic Analytical Crime Lab in Hayward, California, and over the course of nearly 2 years, 232 separate tests were performed on them. They have continually maintained that the results of this testing support Tommy's version of events. Following the murders, bloodstains were found along the underarm of Tommy's shirt, and since it was the same blood type as Perry Edwards, it was initially suspected that Tommy had put his father-in-law in a headlock and bludgeoned him with the metal linoleum crank. Of course, there was no DNA testing back in 1975, but a round of testing was performed in 2001 and showed that the blood on Tommy's shirt actually belonged to Charlie Mays, not Perry Edwards. Of course, since Tommy was believed to have murdered Mays as well, these results did not exonerate him, but Tommy claimed that when he regained consciousness after being shot, he likely crawled around Mays' blood-soaked body in the darkness when he went to the phone to call for help, so this provided an alternate explanation for how Tommy could have got Mays' blood on his clothing without actually killing him. Well, the recent DNA analysis performed some much more extensive testing on Tommy's shirt, pants, and glasses, and found no traces of any blood belonging to Eunice, Perry, and Virginia. All it turned up was a small spot of Perry's blood on Tommy's left shoe, which was mixed with a spot of Mays' blood, but it could have been transferred there during Tommy's struggle with Mays or when he walked through the dark store following the murders. Since Eunice, Perry, and Virginia were all shot in the head at close range with high-caliber bullets and had no exit wounds, and Perry was bludgeoned with the crank, Tommy's defense team have argued that it would have been impossible for him to commit these murders without getting any of the victim's blood spatter on his own clothing. By contrast, the DNA testing showed that traces of Perry's blood were found on Mays' sneakers, as well as the lower thigh and upper calf of his pants, even though their bodies were found several feet apart inside the store. The narrative presented by the prosecution at the original trial was that Tommy lured Mays into the store and killed him about a half hour after he murdered his wife and in-laws, so there didn't seem to be any logical reason for Perry's blood to be on Mays' shoes or pants unless May directly participated in his murder. The bottoms of Mays' shoes also contained Persian cat fur matted with blood and brown rug fibers. The fibers originated from the front of the furniture store near the spot where Virginia was killed, and Tommy and Eunice owned a number of Persian cats at home, which they had never brought inside the store. Therefore, the implication seemed to be that the Edwardses may have inadvertently picked up the cat fur on the soles of their footwear at the Zeigler residence and transferred it inside the store, but Mays wound up getting the fur stuck to his own shoes when he attacked them. Mays also had a swollen right hand with a small puncture wound near the knuckle of his pinky finger, suggesting that he may have punched someone in the face and made contact with a tooth. Perry had evidence of trauma around his mouth, and Tommy had no signs of damage to his hands. Another interesting discovery from the DNA testing was that traces of Perry's blood were found inside Eunice's lapel on her coat, on the back of her pant leg, on one of her shoes, and on a sock inside her shoe. The state's original theory was that Tommy brought Eunice into the store's kitchen and shot her before her parents arrived, as their bodies were found several feet apart. However, the presence of Perry's blood on Eunice seemed to indicate that her body had been repositioned and her clothing rearranged by someone who had Perry's blood on their own hands. Eunice's shoe was likely taken off and put back on, which would explain the presence of her father's blood on her sock. But of course, if Tommy was the perpetrator, how could he have transferred traces of Perry's blood to Eunice's body without getting any blood on his own clothing? Perhaps the biggest revelation from the new testing was that minute traces of touch DNA, which matched Charlie Mays, was found on 5 different spots on Eunice's coat, including her cuffs and the opening of one pocket. Once again, since Tommy supposedly lured Mays inside the store and killed him about a half hour after he killed Eunice, and their bodies were found several feet apart in different locations, how could Mays' DNA have wound up on Eunice's clothing? This suggested that Mays handled Eunice's body at some point and buttoned up her coat, lending credence to the defense's allegations that he was a perpetrator rather than a victim. By contrast, the testing showed no traces of Tommy's touch DNA anywhere on Eunice's coat. If that wasn't enough, it turned out there were also spots of blood on Mays' shirt which did not match him, Tommy, or the other 3 victims, suggesting that someone else was present inside the store when the murders took place, and the DNA extracted from this blood has yet to be matched to anyone in the criminal databases. While Monique Worrell is still the state attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida, and even though she had authorized this new DNA testing back in 2021, her office was not swayed by the results, as this past July, they announced that they did not believe the results were strong enough evidence to conclusively prove Tommy's innocence and overturn his conviction, so they were planning to fight his release from death row. However, shortly thereafter, 9th Judicial Circuit Court Judge Leticia Marquez agreed to a defense motion to hold an evidentiary hearing so that these DNA testing results could be presented in open court. The hearing began at the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando on December the 1st and lasted for an entire week, as both the prosecution and the defense presented evidence and testimony from various experts in order to support the respective arguments about whether or not Tommy should have his conviction overturned and receive a new trial. Tommy's defense team included 83-year-old Terry Hadley, one of Tommy's original trial attorneys, who has never stopped believing in his innocence. The primary defense expert was Richard Eikelenboom, a forensic scientist with Independent Forensic Services who interpreted the results of the new DNA analysis and concluded that they did not point to Tommy being the perpetrator. The state has attempted to counter the defense's claims that the lack of blood on Tommy's clothing proves his innocence, as a raincoat belonging to another employee from the furniture store supposedly went missing around the time of the crime, so the state believes that Tommy could have worn it over his clothing when he killed Eunice, Perry, and Virginia, which would explain the lack of blood, and that he subsequently disposed of it somewhere. Well, this theory about the raincoat was never presented at Tommy's original trial, and the coat itself was never found, and the defense has argued that even if Tommy had worn a raincoat, blood spatter still likely would have wound up on the sleeves inside his cuffs, as well as his pants, shoes, and socks. If you've seen any of the coverage of the recent hearing, you'll know that Tommy personally appeared in court for them, and it's quite jarring to see how old and frail he looks as he is in a wheelchair and using an oxygen tank to breathe. He has experienced a number of health scares in recent years, and actually had to be hospitalized for several weeks after contracting a serious bout of COVID-19 in 2020, but he has managed to pull through, and Tommy's supporters have taken his resiliency as a sign that he will get out of prison alive. Anyway, given that we've just passed the 50-year anniversary of the crime, I was hoping we would get a decision by now from Judge Marquez, but here's the expected timeline for when this will take place. Before Marquez makes a ruling, she needs to receive a transcript of the recent hearing, which will probably be delivered to her in mid-January. After that, both the defense and the prosecution will have 30 days to file their final statements, and once they are delivered to Judge Marquez, she will then have another 30 days to hand down her decision. So this means we will likely have a definitive conclusion sometime in mid-March, and of course, given that this has become my personal passion case, I will probably be on pins and needles until then. As a side note, over 1 year ago, I was approached by fellow podcaster Lauren Samples, co-host of the Paradise After Dark, Missing and Unsolved podcast, who informed me that she was working on a true crime book about cold cases and her work as a victim's advocate, which was titled Through the Shadows, Unsolved Crimes and the Search for Truth. Lauren asked myself and some other podcasters if we would each like to contribute a guest chapter for the book in which we wrote about our personal passion case, which she described as our quote-unquote great white whale. And of course, I said yes and selected the Tommy Zeigler case as my great white whale, which is only appropriate since Lauren and her podcast are based out of Florida, and she is very familiar with the case as well. Well, in early January of this year, I completed my chapter and submitted it to Lauren, but a short time later, the Tampa Bay Times article came out which reported on the results from the DNA testing, so I had to contact Lauren and ask, do you mind if I did some rewrites to that chapter I just sent you? Thankfully, I was able to complete the rewrites and include the new information about the DNA results before the book went to publication, and Through the Shadows finally got released this past summer. But of course, my chapter had to conclude with an open ending about whether or not this great white whale of a case would finally reach a definitive conclusion. It's surreal to think that sometime in 2026, we may have an answer to that question, and of course, I'll be sure to keep you apprised of any further developments in our next update episode. So now it's time to discuss what was arguably the most high-profile cold case resolution in the true crime world in 2025, and that's the Austin Yogurt Shop murders, which I covered as a two-part series in episodes number 343 and 344. On the evening of December the 6th, 1991, a quadruple homicide took place at an I Can't Believe It's Yogurt Shop at a strip mall in Austin, Texas. Two of the victims, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, were employees who were scheduled to close the shop that evening, while the other two victims were Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah Harbison, and Sarah's 13-year-old best friend, Amy Ayers, who both just happened to be waiting there for a ride home with Jennifer and were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The crime appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, as some money was taken, and the victims were all stripped naked and bound and gagged with their own clothing, and some of them were raped before they were each shot in the back of their heads execution style with a .22 caliber weapon. The perpetrator then proceeded to stack the girls' bodies on top of each other before setting them on fire, but Amy's body was found a few feet away from the other three girls, and since she had a second gunshot wound to her head from a .380 caliber pistol, she likely survived the first shot and attempted to crawl away. The case remained unsolved for nearly 8 years, but in 1999, 4 suspects, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Welburn, were charged for their roles in the murders after Springsteen and Scott made confessions to the crime. While both men were convicted at their respective trials, with Springsteen receiving the death penalty, they maintained that their confessions had been coerced. And since Pierce and Welborn never confessed, and there was no other corroborating evidence against them, the charges against them were dropped before they went to trial. After the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Springsteen and Scott's constitutional rights had been violated, both men had their convictions overturned, and the state's case against them hit a major stumbling block when YSTR testing was performed on a vaginal swab that had been taken from Amy Ayers, as a partial male DNA profile was created which did not match any of the 4 suspects. As a result, the charges against Springsteen and Scott were dropped and they were released from prison, but they were never officially exonerated per se, and Maurice Pierce would be shot to death during an unrelated altercation with police in 2010. Now, my Trail Went Cold episodes about this case were released in August of 2023 when I attended the True Crime Podcast Festival in Austin, and since the strip mall where the murders took place happened to be located just a few miles from the hotel, I decided to take a trip there. The yogurt shop is long gone and has been replaced by a tanning salon, but the parking lot does contain a memorial plaque for the 4 victims, and it was quite haunting to be at this spot, knowing that such an horrific crime took place there. This past August, a 4-part documentary series about this case titled The Yogurt Shop Murders was released by HBO, and when I first watched it, I was surprised that they did not make mention of what I felt was the most promising lead in the case. It turned out that the last known customers to have frequented the yogurt shop before the murders took place reported having seen 2 men sitting at one of the tables near closing time. Since these 2 men were never tracked down or identified, they seemed like the most likely candidates to have been the real killers, so I could not figure out why this lead was not included in the docuseries. Well, in retrospect, perhaps the reason for this was because law enforcement was zeroing in on a very promising suspect and were now convinced that a sole perpetrator was responsible for this crime. Sure enough, on September the 26th, a month and a half after the docuseries came out, the Austin Police Department held a press conference to announce that they had officially solved the case and identified the perpetrator as Robert Eugene Brashers, a career criminal who had been deceased for over 26 years. It turned out that Brashers was a serial killer who had committed a number of other murders in different states, but nobody realized the full extent of his crimes until years after he was dead. Brashers' first known violent crime took place in Port St. Lucie, Florida on November the 22nd, 1985, when he picked up a 24-year-old woman named Michelle Wilkerson at a bar and attempted to sexually assault her in his truck. When Wilkerson fought him off, Brasher severely beat her and shot her twice in both the neck and the head, but miraculously, Wilkerson managed to escape his truck and hid in a culvert before she managed to make it to a nearby house to seek help. Wilkerson received medical attention and wound up surviving, and after she provided a description of Brasher's and his truck, he was arrested later that night. As part of a plea deal, Wilkerson agreed to enter a plea of no contest to the charge of attempted second-degree murder, but even though he received a 12-year prison sentence, he only wound up serving just over 3 years before he was paroled for good conduct in May of 1989. And that decision is absolutely infuriating because if Brasher's had served out his full sentence, he never would have been in Austin in December of 1991, and the yogurt shop murders would not have taken place. Anyway, Brasher's wound up violating his parole, and in 1992, he was convicted in Cobb County, Georgia on the charges of possession of a stolen vehicle and possession of a stolen pistol, and he would spend the next 5 years in prison. Prior to his arrest, Brasher's had gotten married and had a daughter who was born only 4 months before the yogurt shop murders took place, and following his release, he lived with his wife, daughter, and 2 stepdaughters in Paragould, Arkansas. In April of 1998, Brasher's was arrested for attempting to break into a woman's home in Paragould as he had cut the phone lines and had a gun and a video camera in his possession. He was charged with attempted residential burglary, being a felon in possession of a firearm, and criminal mischief, and while it sounds like he was released on bond, he later became a wanted fugitive after he failed to appear in court in October of that year. On January the 13th, 1999, Brasher's and his family were staying at a motel in Kennett, Missouri, but he was driving a stolen vehicle at that time. After the local police noticed it parked outside, an armed standoff ensued in which Brasher's held his family hostage inside his motel room and kept a .380 caliber pistol pointed at his head. After 4 hours of negotiations, Brasher's agreed to release his family until he shot himself in the head, but while he did not immediately die, he succumbed to his wounds in the hospital 6 days later at the age of 40. Now, in retrospect, that might have seemed like an extreme reaction on his part, but what the authorities did not realize at that time was that Brasher's had already been responsible for a number of unsolved murders. It was not until 2018 when genetic genealogy started posthumously linking Brasher's DNA to a number of cold cases from different states, and everyone started learning the full extent of his crimes. Brasher's wound up getting linked to the rape and murder of 28-year-old Jenny Zetricki, who was bludgeoned and fatally strangled with pantyhose inside her apartment in Greenville, South Carolina on April the 5th, 1990, and in an interesting parallel to the yogurt shop case, Zetricki was tied up with her own clothing. Brasher's was also linked to the rape of a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee on March the 11th, 1997, as he had forced his way into a residence and tied up its 4 occupants at gunpoint before he sexually assaulted the victim. On March the 28th, 1998, Brasher's was responsible for the double murder of 38-year-old Sherry Shearer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan Shearer after forcing his way into their farmhouse near Portageville, Missouri, where he proceeded to tie up both victims and rape Megan before shooting both her and her mother with a .22 caliber gun. Remarkably, Brasher's then traveled 40 miles across the state line to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and only about 2 hours after the double homicide, he attempted to break into the mobile home of a 25-year-old woman. After she fought him off and shut the door, Brasher's fired his gun through the door and struck her in the arm, but she wound up surviving and Brasher's fled the scene. Ballistics evidence was used to determine that the woman had been shot with the same gun used to murder the Shearers, proving that the same perpetrator was responsible for both crimes. Now, I mentioned earlier that YSTR testing had extracted a partial male DNA profile from a vaginal swab taken from Amy Ayers after the Austin yogurt shop murders, but even though it excluded the 4 suspects who were originally charged with the crime, it could not be used to conclusively implicate a suspect. The partial profile only had 27 markers, meaning that it could have conceivably matched thousands of individuals, so additional corroborating evidence would be required to identify the perpetrator. Well, this came about back in June when Daniel Jackson, the current lead detective on the yogurt shop case, decided to submit information about a spent .380 shell casing, which had been found in the drain at the murder scene, into the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, a database which can link crime scenes and firearms through the digital imaging of spent bullet and cartridge case evidence. It wound up being matched to an unsolved murder from Kentucky, but in order not to potentially jeopardize an ongoing investigation, the authorities have not yet revealed any specific details about that case. But it sounds like DNA evidence from the Kentucky murder has been compared to Brasher's, and he cannot be excluded, so he is considered to be a suspect. Anyway, this ballistics match compelled Jackson to attempt a new search with the partial DNA profile, and it wound up getting a hit in the South Carolina State Crime Lab, as Brasher's DNA profile was now in their system after he was linked to the murder of Jenny Zetricki. But of course, since the partial profile only had 27 markers, this was not yet definitive proof that Brasher's was the offender in the yogurt shop murders. However, a decision was made to send some of Amy Ayer's fingernail clippings to the South Carolina State Crime Lab for testing, as she had apparently fought back against her killer, so her nails contained traces of male DNA. The reason this DNA testing had not been tested earlier was because there was a risk it could consume the entire sample, but since Brasher seemed like a very compelling suspect, they decided to go through with it, and the DNA wound up matching Brasher's profile with a probability of 2.5 million to 1. If that wasn't enough, ballistic tests would show that the shell casing found in the drain at the yogurt shop was consistent with patterns produced by the .380 caliber pistol that Brasher's had used to shoot himself at the motel in Kennett in January of 1999. Investigators felt that the totality of the evidence proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brasher's was the killer, so they held a press conference to announce that the case was now solved. It appears that Brasher's committed the crime completely on his own, as Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza stated that the quote-unquote overwhelming weight of the evidence points to the guilt of one man. As far as anyone could tell, Brasher's did not have any ties to Austin, which is why he never popped up on the radar as a potential suspect. But according to Brasher's daughter, since her father was a contractor, he would often travel and be away from their home in Paragould in order to take construction jobs, which explains why he committed crimes in a number of different states. It appears that Brasher's may have been passing through Austin, and for reasons we'll probably never know, he felt the compulsion to stop by the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop at closing time and commit a robbery/quadruple homicide. Another crazy twist to this whole saga is that after leaving Austin, Brasher started traveling west in order to visit his father in Arizona, but at the time, he was driving a truck which had been stolen in Georgia. On December the 8th, less than 48 hours after the crime took place, Brasher's was stopped by the United States Border Patrol at a checkpoint between El Paso, Texas and Las Cruces, New Mexico. Brasher's briefly made an attempt to flee before he was taken into custody, and a .380 caliber pistol was found inside the stolen truck. When Brasher's went to prison in Georgia a few months later, it appears that the pistol was given to his father, but after Brasher's finished serving his sentence and was released, he must have taken the pistol back, because serial numbers show that it was the same gun he used to shoot himself in 1999. So yes, it appears that just 2 days after the Austin yogurt shop murders took place, the authorities had one of the murder weapons in their possession and didn't even realize it, so it eventually wound up back in the hands of the perpetrator. At the press conference announcing the resolution in this case, Jose Garza delivered a formal apology to the 4 individuals who were charged with the murders in 1999. Like I mentioned earlier, even when these guys had their convictions overturned or the charges dropped, they were never declared factually innocent. Maurice Pierce was killed in 2010, and Forrest Wellburn has stayed completely out of the spotlight these past 25 years, but Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott are currently looking at options for compensation for the time they spent in prison, and the Travis County District Attorney's Office has recently filed a motion to start the process towards exonerating them. But it's pretty ironic that at the time these 2 men falsely confessed to the crime, the real killer had already been dead for several months, and no one even knew it. The investigation into Robert Eugene Brasher's is still ongoing, as the authorities are looking to see if he is responsible for additional crimes during his lifetime. At the time of this recording, he has been positively linked to the murders of at least 7 victims, 5 of whom are children, as well as at least 1 attempted murder and 1 additional assault, so it's safe to say that he was an absolute monster. It's a shame that he took his own life before he had to face justice for most of these horrible crimes, but if he had lived longer, who knows how many more people he might have harmed. But it's good to know that we live in an era where forensics have advanced so much that unsolved cold cases can be definitively linked to suspects after they are already deceased, and one of the most infamous and horrific crimes of the modern era has finally reached a conclusive resolution. So the next case we're going to discuss is not one that was on my bingo card to be solved this year since it took place 67 years ago, and I'm talking about the disappearance of the Martin family, which I covered on episode number 161. On December the 7th, 1958, 54-year-old Kenneth Martin, his 48-year-old wife Barbara, and their 3 children, 14-year-old Barbie, 12-year-old Virginia, and 10-year-old Susan, left their home in Portland, Oregon in order to take a trip to the Columbia River Gorge to pick up some greenery to make Christmas decorations. They were last seen eating dinner at a restaurant in the town of Hood River, but after they drove away, both the family and their red and white 1954 Ford station wagon would vanish without a trace. 5 months later, in May of 1959, the bodies of Virginia and Susan were both found floating at different spots in the Columbia River. Shortly before this took place, the crew on a river drilling rig had accidentally gotten their anchor hooked on something large at the bottom of the river, but the anchor became dislodged before they could bring this object to the surface. It's been theorized that they likely got the anchor caught on the sunken station wagon and wound up dislodging Virginia and Susan's bodies from the vehicle, causing them to float downstream. The bodies of Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie were likely still trapped inside, but all future attempts to find the vehicle again were unsuccessful. Since some tire tracks were found at the edge of a nearby cliff just outside the town of Cascade Locks, the most logical theory was that the Martins may have driven into the river and the whole thing was nothing more than a tragic accident. However, there were a number of strange oddities which made some investigators suspect there might be more to this story. For starters, the tracks were found east of the restaurant in Hood River where the Martins were last seen, even though the route home to Portland would have required them to head west in the opposite direction. Shortly after they left the restaurant, witnesses reported having seen their station wagon parked by the side of the road next to a white Chevrolet. The Chevrolet had recently been stolen from California by a pair of ex-convicts who were both seen in the same restaurant as the Martins and reportedly left there at the same time as the family. A blood-stained .38 caliber Colt Commander handgun was also found near the spot where the Martin station wagon had been parked, and in an extremely odd coincidence, it turned out that years earlier, the same gun had been stolen from a department store where the Martin's surviving son Donald had worked before he was fired for theft. At the time his family went missing, Donald was enlisted in the Navy and stationed on the other side of the country in New York State. But since he reportedly did not get along with his father, there was always speculation that the Martins may have been murdered before their station wagon was deliberately run off the cliff into the Columbia River, and perhaps Donald and the 2 ex-cons were involved. However, since Kenneth, Barbara, Barbie, and the station wagon could not be found, there was never any direct evidence of foul play, and Donald passed away in 2004. Well, for many decades, the investigation into this case was pretty much trapped in limbo, as the Hood River County Sheriff's Office did not want to devote any time and resources to searching the Columbia River without conclusive evidence that Martin's station wagon was submerged there. But in 2018, the story captured the attention of Archer Mayo, a professional diver who lived across the river in White Salmon, Washington, and took the initiative to perform his own independent investigation. Over the years, Mayo performed several exploratory dives of the Columbia River, and in November of 2024, he dove 50 feet down into the water at a spot near the cliff where the tire tracks had been found and discovered several submerged cars. Mayo used a vacuum dredger on these vehicles and noticed what appeared to be an older model Ford station wagon, which was lodged upside down inside a 20-foot pit in the middle of the canal and was buried beneath some rock, slit, and other debris. Mayo became convinced this was the Martins' missing station wagon, so he managed to convince the Hood River County Sheriff's Office to perform their own recovery operation, which took place back on March the 6th and 7th of this year. A group of commercial divers attempted to use a crane to pull the submerged vehicle out of the water, but due to heavy corrosion and the weight of the debris, the chassis became detached from the rest of the vehicle and was the only part that could be recovered from the river. The chassis contained the engine, tires, and rear axle, so these parts would be sent to the state crime lab in hopes that they could check the vehicle's identification number and confirm if the submerged car belonged to the Martins. The sheriff's office later said that after processing the recovered parts and comparing the serial numbers to records from the Ford Motor Company, they believed that the parts did match the make, model, and color of the missing vehicle. However, since they were unable to recover the vehicle identification number, they could not say with 100% certainty that it was the Martin station wagon. On March the 24th, the sheriff's office announced that they were halting the recovery efforts as a spokesperson told the media, quote, "Due to the difficulties associated with retrieving the chassis and the corroded condition it was in, the HRCSO does not feel that expanding further time or resources on the retrieval of the remainder of the vehicle would be prudent, nor would it be guaranteed of success." End quote. While this did not dissuade Archer Mayo, as he continued to perform his own dives in the river, and on August the 22nd, he publicly announced that he had managed to find what was left of the submerged station wagon, and after swimming inside and spending weeks removing piles of debris, he was able to recover some human remains and other personal items. Mayo said that the remains appeared to belong to two adults, though he may have managed to recover remains that belonged to a third person, and these presumably belonged to Kenneth, Barbara, and possibly Barbie Martin. The items Mayo brought to the surface include shoe fragments, a girl's nylon sock, a children's cap gun, the car's gas pedal, 2 seat belts, and most importantly, a camera case with Kenneth Martin's name and most of his address on it, which seems to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is the family's submerged vehicle. Mayo said that the remains have been delivered to the authorities and will be forwarded to the state forensic anthropologist. However, the Hood River County Sheriff's Office has not provided any official statement on the discovery of these remains, as a spokesperson told the media that they could not comment any further since this was an active investigation. Mayo said that he has done pretty much everything he can with the recovery effort, and since the submerged vehicle was a very dangerous environment, he has since filled it up with gravel in order to prevent anyone else from swimming inside it. You can tell that this whole thing was a major passion project for Mayo, and you have to give him immense credit because he was bound and determined to recover the Martins' remains and solve this case even after law enforcement had already given up. These remains are currently being examined and subjected to forensic testing, but they have not yet been positively identified as belonging to anyone from the Martin family. It will be interesting to see if they show any signs of foul play, but as it stands right now, I get the impression that the authorities feel that the Martins drove into the river accidentally, so it's possible that all the other odd details surrounding this case, such as the blood-stained gun, might be nothing more than red herrings. Whatever the case, it is pretty remarkable that we're getting any sort of resolution in this case after 67 years, and I will definitely keep you apprised of any further developments. So our next update is a very special one. Many of you probably know that before I started The Trail Went Cold, I used to write articles about cold cases and unsolved mysteries for the website listverse.com, and in June of 2013, I published an article titled 10 Mysterious Cases Involving Unidentified People, in which I listed off 10 different cases involving unidentified John or Jane Does. Well, over the past several years, genetic genealogy has become such a prominent tool in cold case investigations that it has paved the way to literally hundreds of these unidentified decedents getting their names back. In fact, thanks to the work of such organizations as the DNA Doe Project and Author Incorporated, it's now almost become a daily occurrence to hear a new announcement about a John or Jane Doe getting identified. Well, as the years went on, all of the decedents listed in my Listverse article gradually started getting their names back until things reached the point where 9 out of the 10 entries on that list had been identified. For the longest time, there was one lone holdout, an unidentified murder victim known as Little Miss Panasoffkee, who was featured on episode number 129. The victim in question was a young woman who was found floating beneath an overpass in Shady Brook Creek, which fed into Lake Panasoffkee in Sumter County, Florida, on February the 19th, 1971, and she had been strangled to death with a belt, which was found wrapped around her neck. The victim was buried and pretty much forgotten about for several years until Sumter County Sheriff Jamie Adams decided to reopen the case in order to get her identified. He made arrangements to exhume her body for new forensic testing, and the story received national exposure when it was profiled on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in 1992. In 2012, isotope testing was performed on the victim's teeth, which led a geological scientist to conclude that she may have originally hailed from the small fishing port town of Lavrion, Greece. In fact, there was speculation that she was a young woman known only as Constantina, who apparently left Greece during the early 1970s to travel to the United States and had not been heard from since. I always assumed this was the main reason why Little Miss Panasoffkee had not been identified, as Europe has different laws in place in regards to the usage of genetic genealogy, so if the victim did not have any living relatives in North America, then it would be more difficult to trace her lineage and figure out who she was. Well, in the end, it turned out this theory was completely wrong, as the victim was actually an American-born citizen all along, and her identification would not be made via genetic genealogy, but through the rather old-fashioned method of a fingerprint match. On October the 29th of this year, the Sumter County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce that Little Miss Panasoffkee had been identified as Maureen Lou Rowan, who was 21 years old at the time of her murder and went by the nickname Cookie. Maureen/Cookie was born on March the 21st, 1949 in York County, Maine, to parents Fred and Mary Minor. Cookie eventually relocated to Tampa, Florida, and in 1967 she got married to her husband, Charles Emery Rowan, and they had 2 children together. However, their marriage was described as a tumultuous and unhappy one, and the couple eventually separated. In November of 1970, 2 months before Cookie's body was discovered, Emery filed for divorce from her. It would be finalized the following August, and Emery reportedly told people that Cookie had left on her own, and he made no attempt to officially file a missing persons report for her. It appears that the tissue samples used for the isotope testing may have been contaminated by the formaldehyde gel which was used during the embalming process after Cookie's body was found, which affected the results and caused investigators to operate under the false assumption that she was from Greece. These embalming chemicals also apparently played a role in causing Cookie's DNA to degrade so much that all attempts to extract a full profile for the purposes of genetic genealogy were unsuccessful. In the past, attempts had been made to identify Cookie through her fingerprints, and no match was made, but near the beginning of 2025, the Sumter County Sheriff's Office acquired the Storm Automated Biometric Identification System, a cloud-based digital fingerprint system. Little Miss Panasoffkee's latent prints were eventually submitted into the system, which cross-referenced them with digitized versions of fingerprint records from other counties, and they wound up matching Cookie, as she had once been arrested for passing a bounce check in Tampa in 1970, and her prints were on file. After watching his interviews on Unsolved Mysteries, I always had a soft spot for Sumter County Sheriff Jamie Adams, particularly when he said, quote, "It bothered me that this young girl had never been identified, and being a daddy and a granddaddy, I couldn't accept the fact that somebody out there couldn't come forward and let us know who this young girl was." End quote. Well, sadly, Cookie's parents passed away in the years after she was found, as her father died in 1973 and her mother died in 1979, and Sheriff Adams passed away in 2022 without living long enough to witness Cookie's identification. But if it wasn't for him taking the initiative to make sure she got identified, Cookie probably would have been lost to history. As for Cookie's former husband, Emery Rowan, he died in October of 2015 at the age of 73, but while investigators consider him to be a person of interest, they've said that for the moment, they have insufficient evidence to formally name him as the suspect. I will say that this situation has given me flashbacks to a case that I've discussed on previous update episodes, and that's the Lady of the Dunes, an unidentified murder victim who was found in Barnstable County, Massachusetts in July of 1974. 3 years ago, she was finally identified as 37-year-old Ruth Marie Terry, who was married to a man named Guy Moldavan at the time of her death. Even though Guy had passed away in 2002, the authorities would later announce that based on information they had uncovered during their investigation, they were confident that Guy had murdered his wife, and they officially named him as Ruth's killer and closed the case. The investigation into Cookie's murder is currently an active one, as the authorities are seeking information from anyone who knew or crossed paths with Emery or Cookie during the early 1970s to see if they remember anything important. So if Cookie was murdered by her husband, perhaps they will eventually uncover evidence which will allow them to say with 100% certainty that Emery was the killer. At the moment, this is technically still a half-solved mystery, and I'll keep you apprised of any new developments, but obviously, the most important thing is that after 54 years, Maureen Cookie Rowan finally has her name back. Now we're going to talk about a very recent case which was featured on The Trail Went Cold, and that's the disappearance of 39-year-old Nikki Chang Saley McCain, which I covered last December on episode number 408. The episode came out only 6.5 months after Nikki went missing, as the case was sent my way by my true crime researcher friend Haley Gray, who put me in touch with Nikki's sisters. Nikki was a mother of 4 children who lived in Redding, California, and at the time she disappeared, she was planning to divorce her estranged husband, Tyler McCain, after years of being trapped in an abusive marriage. In November of 2023, there was an incident where Nikki was severely beaten and assaulted by Tyler at their home, and after escaping and seeking medical treatment at the hospital, she decided to press charges against him, and Tyler was arrested on 4 separate felony counts. 1 count of corporal injury to a spouse, 1 count of false imprisonment by violence, 1 count of making criminal threats, and 1 count of assault likely to produce great bodily injury. Tyler was released on bond and would enter a plea of not guilty, but before his trial for these charges could take place, Nikki would vanish without a trace. Nikki was last confirmed to be alive shortly after midnight on the evening of May the 18th, 2024, when she texted one of her sisters from a hospital in Redding and said she was planning to go see Tyler's mother to return her vehicle to her. However, Nikki was never heard from again, and 1 week later, her abandoned truck would be discovered 50 miles away in a remote rural area of Tehama County. The following month, Nikki failed to resurface for a hearing about Tyler's domestic violence trial, and since the Shasta County District Attorney's Office felt they could not get a conviction without Nikki's testimony, all the charges against Tyler were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Well, Tyler and other members of his family have told contradictory and often changing stories about the last time they saw Nikki and done their fair share of suspicious things, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of speculation that the timing of Nikki's disappearance was not a coincidence. However, on August the 20th of this year, the Shasta County District Attorney's Office and the Shasta County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce that Tyler had been arrested for Nikki's murder, as he was charged with 1 count of murder and a special circumstance that the murder was committed with the intent to prevent testimony. In addition, Tyler's 4 domestic violence charges from 2023 have been refiled. Even though Nikki has still not been found, the authorities announced that the arrest came about after a confidential informant came forward and reported that Tyler had admitted to killing Nikki after a domestic violence incident on May the 18th, 2024, but at the moment, limited information has been released to the public in order to protect the investigation's integrity, and I have no idea what other evidence against Tyler there may be. Tyler is currently being held in custody at the Shasta County Jail without bail, and in September, a preliminary hearing took place in Shasta County Superior Court, which lasted for 8 days and included testimony from numerous witnesses, and Judge Thomas Bender ultimately ruled that there was enough evidence to take Tyler to trial. Tyler subsequently pled not guilty to all of the charges, and his trial was scheduled to begin on November the 18th, but 6 days before that, his defense team appeared at a trial readiness conference with Superior Court Judge Adam Ryan to request a delay because they say they need more time to prepare. Judge Ryan agreed to the request, and just a few days before I recorded this episode, it was announced that the new trial start date would be March the 17th, 2026. Considering that I've covered a lot of other cases on this podcast in which a defendant was charged with murder and had to remain behind bars for years before their trial took place, things are moving remarkably quickly here. If Tyler was responsible for Nikki's disappearance, then I hope her remains can be recovered at some point, and of course once the trial takes place, I will be sure to provide additional updates. So before I share a next update, I suppose I should apologize in advance, because this one actually occurred back in 2024, but I completely missed it, and I did not learn about this new development until after last year's update episode came out. In September of 2022, I released episode number 295, which covered the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and featured no less than 9 Canadian cold cases from Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Well, the first case I discussed on that episode was the murder of 15-year-old Mary Ann Birmingham, who was stabbed to death inside her residence in Frobisher Bay in the Northwest Territories on May 25, 1986. Just under 6 months later, in November of that year, a Frobisher Bay resident named Jopi Astiktak was arrested and charged with the murders of 51-year-old Ulayu Isiak and her 21-year-old son Putugu Isiak, who were both brutally stabbed to death inside their home. Astiktak was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment, but since the crime seemed to have a number of similarities to the murder of Mary Ann Birmingham, Astiktak was looked at as a potential suspect in that case. At one point, he was actually charged with Mary Ann's murder, but after a preliminary inquiry, a territorial court judge found that there was insufficient evidence to bring the case to trial, so the charge against Astiktak was dropped, and he continually denied any involvement. Well, as the years went on, Astiktak would be transferred to some medium and minimum security facilities, and by June of 2024, he was in his 60s and in poor health, as he required a walker to move around. The Parole Board of Canada ultimately decided that Astiktak could be released from prison on a 6-month term of day parole, which will require him to live in a halfway house in Ottawa, Ontario, which incidentally happens to be my current hometown, and I believe this is the first time that Ottawa has ever been connected to a case featured on The Trail Went Cold. However, Astiktak would only be on day parole for 3 months, as on September the 24th, he was arrested on a Canada-wide warrant which was circulated by the Nunavut RCMP in regards to Mary Ann Birmingham's case, and he was charged with second-degree murder. It has not been publicly released if any new evidence surfaced which led to Astiktak being arrested after all these years, only that the Nunavut RCMP's Major Crimes Unit worked alongside the Public Prosecution Service of Canada in order to secure a second-degree murder indictment. Now, in 1987, Frobisher Bay changed its name to Iqaluit, and it later became the capital of Nunavut after it was separated from the Northwest Territories. So following his arrest, Astiktak was extradited back to Iqaluit, and he's currently being held without bail. Since the Nunavut Court of Justice's schedule is currently filled up for 2026, plans are being made to set a trial date for Astiktak for sometime in 2027. It may be another year or two before I can provide our next update about this case, but I will certainly do so once it happens. Anyway, there are some occasions when I will provide updates on cases which were not the main subject of a Trail Went Cold episode, but got mentioned on the podcast because of their potential connection to the featured case. Back in 2017, I released mini-sode number 22 about the disappearance of Paige Renkoski, a 30-year-old substitute school teacher from Okemos, Michigan, who went missing on May the 24th, 1990, after her abandoned car was discovered with the engine running on the westbound shoulder of Interstate 96 near the village of Fowlerville. Paige's purse and shoes were still inside the vehicle, and eyewitnesses report having seen her standing outside speaking to a pair of unidentified black males before she disappeared. Well, I don't have any new developments to report on in this case, but on the minisode, I discussed the possibility of Paige's disappearance being connected to the murder of a 30-year-old Canton Township woman named Beverly Wivel. 8 months earlier, on September the 18th, 1989, Beverly was found shot to death on Gottfredson Road in Superior Township. She had just dropped off her son at school and likely pulled over to sleep inside her vehicle before she was attacked, sexually assaulted, and shot with a .45 caliber gun. The assailant then stole Beverly's car and ran over her legs as he sped away, and her abandoned vehicle would later be found in Griffin Park. Much like with Page's case, the engine was still running, and Beverly's purse and shoes were inside, but another compelling similarity is that Page had spent the afternoon in Griffin Park with a friend shortly before she drove down Interstate 96 and vanished. This led to speculation that the two crimes might be connected, and in January of 2024, the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office submitted DNA from a rape kit in Beverly's case to Othram Incorporated in Texas in hopes that they could build a profile for the perpetrator. Well, after the profile was completed, genetic genealogy was used to link the DNA to a 69-year-old suspect named Buster Robbins, who lived with his wife in the town of Almont, Michigan. After performing surveillance on Robbins, investigators collected several items he had used, including some plastic straws, and sent them to the Michigan State Police Lab for a DNA comparison, and it wound up matching the DNA from the rape kit. On January the 3rd, Robbins was taken into custody and charged with felony murder. On the surface, Robbins might seem to be an unlikely suspect, as he had no prior criminal record and has 4 children and a number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But Robbins' wife has since filed for divorce and made sexual assault allegations against him, claiming that he would sneak other men into the residence to have sex with her without her consent. In addition, child sexual abuse material was found on a tablet he owned. Robbins has since entered a plea of not guilty and was released on a $5 million bond, and at the moment, he is required to reside with his daughter and wear a GPS tether. It appears that Robbins did not personally know Beverly, and while no official date has been set, his trial is scheduled to take place sometime in 2026. The authorities have confirmed that Robbins is under investigation for other crimes, and he is considered to be a person of interest in the disappearance of Paige Runkoski, though I will add the disclaimer that Robbins is white and does not match the description of the 2 black males seen speaking with Paige before she went missing. Regardless, I will keep you apprised of any further developments in both these cases. So now we're going to talk about some cases where we don't have a resolution yet, but there have been some interesting developments. You might recall that on our last update episode, we talked about some major developments which took place last year in a very high-profile missing children's case, and of course, I'm referring to the 2000 disappearance of 9-year-old Aisha Degree, which I covered on minisode number 5. As a brief recap, Aisha lived with her parents and older brother in Shelby, North Carolina, but for reasons that are still unknown, she decided to leave her home in the middle of the night during a heavy rainstorm on Valentine's Day in 2000, and numerous motorists reported seeing a girl matching her description walking down North Carolina Highway 18. In August of 2001, a book bag that Aisha had packed for herself before she left her home was found buried at a construction site about 26 miles north of Shelby, and it was double wrapped in a pair of plastic trash bags. Well, in September of 2024, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office and the FBI announced that they now believe that Aisha was the victim of a homicide. They named Roy Lee Dedman and Connie Elliott Dedman, a currently separated married couple, as suspects, and also performed searches on a number of properties which once belonged to them. It turned out that DNA testing had linked a hair stem sample found on an undershirt inside Aisha's book bag to the couple's youngest daughter, Annalie Dedman Ramirez, who would have been 13 years old at the time of Aisha's disappearance. In addition, other items in Aisha's book bag contained DNA which matched a man named Russell Underhill, who died in 2004 at the age of 54. At the time of Aisha's disappearance, Underhill had been residing at a rest home in Shelby called the Cleveland Healthcare Center, where Connie Dedman was the administrator and Roy Dedman was listed as his emergency contact. In addition to Anna Lee, the Dedmans also had 2 other daughters, Sarah Dedman Capel and Lizzie Dedman Foster, who were 15 and 16 years old respectively in 2000, and back then, Roy was apparently known for having them use Highway 18 to drive patients, such as Russell Underhill, to and from his rest home and the hospital. It's not entirely clear how all these pieces of the puzzle fit together, but here's a key sentence from the search warrant that was used to search the Dedmans' property. Quote, "Due to the age of Roy Dedman and Connie Dedman's 3 daughters in the year of 2000, investigators believe adult assistance from Roy Dedman and Connie Dedman would have been necessary in the execution and/or concealment of the crime. Indeed, investigators now seem certain that Aisha was killed on the same night she went missing before her body was concealed." The obvious implication seems to be that one or more of the Dedman daughters may have been transporting Russell Underhill somewhere during the early morning hours of February the 14th, 2000, when they crossed paths with Aisha and somehow caused her death, possibly by an accidental hit and run. As far as anyone can tell, the Degree and Dedman families did not know each other, so there seems to be no innocent reason why DNA belonging to Underhill and Anna Lee Dedman Ramirez would be on items inside Aisha's book bag. Well, at the time of this recording, Aisha has still not been found, and no criminal charges have been filed against anyone, but here are some new developments which have taken place in 2025. This past February, shortly after the 25-year anniversary of Aisha's disappearance, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office obtained and executed 3 new search warrants in connection to Sarah Dedman Capel and Lizzie Dedman Foster. Shortly after Aisha's connection to the Dedman family was made public, a man came forward and told investigators that he often partied with the 3 Dedman daughters during the mid-2000s. At one of these parties, this man claimed that he overheard an incriminating conversation between Sarah and Lizzie, as Lizzie seemed visibly upset and flat out said, quote, "I killed Aisha Degree," before Sarah told her to shut up. When the man was asked to take a polygraph to recount this incident, he apparently passed. According to the new search warrants, there was evidence to indicate that Sarah, Lizzie, and Roy had engaged in obstruction of justice, though no charges have been filed. After the warrants were executed, cell phones belonging to all 3 of these individuals were seized, as law enforcement was particularly interested in Lizzie's iCloud account, which contained messages from September of 2024 with some quote-unquote conversations of interest between Lizzie, Sarah, their sister Anna Lee, and Lizzie's ex-husband. I'm not going to recount all their exchanges here, but many of them have been posted online. One of the most interesting quotes from Sarah is when she wrote, quote, "I don't remember that shirt. I'm scared though. Dad is probably going to be a huge suspect," end quote. And some of the most interesting quotes from Lizzie include, quote, "The theory is I did it. Accident. Covered it up," end quote, and, quote, "I feel so horrible. So horrible. I don't know what to do. I caused this," end quote. Lizzie also agreed to take a polygraph in which she was asked if she was concealing information, and the results supposedly found her to be deceptive. It's also worth noting that this past April, law enforcement performed a search on another piece of property which had been owned by Roy and Connie Dedman in 2000 before they sold it 4 years later, though law enforcement has not commented on whether or not anything of interest was found. While the Dedman family have not given interviews to the media, their official spokesperson, Skip Foster, who was the editor-in-chief of the Shelby Star back in 2000, provided this statement back in July, quote, "There's a courtroom, and then there's the courtroom of public opinion, and there's only been one side of this story told. They want to find out what happened as much as anybody, but they want their story told," end quote. Foster has also claimed that the Dedmans did not even own a vehicle at the time of Aisha's disappearance and denied that the family had any involvement. It appears that the investigation is in a holding pattern at the moment, but I'm sure that law enforcement knows a lot more than they're letting on and being extra careful about what they release to the public, though they have said that they have made, quote-unquote, significant progress. But of course, even if it turns out that the Dedman family was responsible for Aisha's disappearance, that still doesn't explain why she left her home in the middle of the night in the first place. A $100,000 reward is currently being offered for information, so I do hope that we eventually learn the full truth about what happened and Aisha is returned to her family. So now we're going to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to discuss a few cases connected to Ireland's Vanishing Triangle, which we covered on episode number 142. Our episode explored the disappearances of 8 women who vanished within a triangular-shaped radius surrounding Dublin during one 5-year period during the 1990s, but while there was speculation that a serial killer could have been operating in the area and was responsible for all or some of these disappearances, I've always been inclined to believe that they are not connected. At the end of our last update episode, I discussed a recent development in the disappearance of 21-year-old Josephine Dullard, who went by the nickname JoJo, and vanished while in the midst of traveling from Dublin to her hometown of Callan on the evening of November the 9th, 1995. JoJo was last confirmed to be alive in the village of Moon, as witnesses recalled seeing a woman matching her description leaning in the back door of a dark-colored vehicle. Well, in November of 2024, it was announced that an unnamed 55-year-old suspect, one of the last known people to see JoJo alive, had been arrested by Ireland's police force, the Gardaí, on suspicion of murder, and searches were being performed on 2 properties he owned. Now, in Ireland, if someone is arrested on suspicion of murder, that doesn't necessarily mean they're being charged, as it only means that they can be detained and questioned for up to 24 hours under the provisions of Section 4 of the Criminal Justice Act while the Gardaí decides what to do. And here, it does not sound like they considered the evidence to be strong enough to file charges, so the suspect was released from custody. Unfortunately, there have not been any further developments in the investigation since my last update episode, though rumors have always circulated that the suspect is the son of a prominent former politician, which is why he was not properly investigated back in 1995. But while the JoJo Dullard case is at a standstill again, there have actually been some developments in 2 other Vanishing Triangle cases this past year. Chronologically, the first case to be lumped in with the Vanishing Triangle disappearances is that of 26-year-old Annie McCarrick, an American citizen who was born in Long Island, New York, before she moved to Dublin. On the afternoon of March the 26th, 1993, Annie vanished after leaving her apartment in the Sandymount suburb as she was supposedly planning to make a trip to the Wicklow Mountains and boarded a bus to the town of Enniskerry, where numerous witnesses reported seeing her in a pub later that night. Well, I completely missed this development at the time, but in March of 2023, around the 30th anniversary of Annie's disappearance, the Gardaí announced that they were upgrading her case from a missing persons investigation to a murder inquiry, and now considered 2 unnamed brothers who had been friends with Annie and lived near her apartment in Sandymount to be potential suspects. Shortly before Annie went missing, one of these brothers had allegedly harassed her and struck her during an argument, and she apparently confided in some friends that she had, quote-unquote, messed up bad. The brothers were both interviewed during the original investigation, but were not considered to be suspects at the time, since they provided alibis to show that they were both away from Sandymount on the weekend Annie went missing. When Annie's father and uncle traveled from the United States to Ireland, the 2 brothers assisted with their search effort, but there was apparently some tension between them, as Annie's family felt that the brothers came across as overbearing and would be asking too many questions about the investigation. Well, on June the 12th of this past year, it was announced that the brother who allegedly harassed and assaulted Annie had been arrested by the Gardaí at his home in County Meath on suspicion of murder. Even though his name has still not been released publicly, he is described as being a wealthy 62-year-old businessman, and following his arrest, the Gardaí used a cadaver dog to search a house and garden in the suburban village of Clondalkin, as the suspect's parents had once lived there. The other brother is currently being hospitalized in France due to long-term health issues, and it's been reported that in the months prior to the arrest, the Gardaí traveled to France to interview him, and he apparently provided information which weakened the brother's original alibi from 1993. But of course, like I just mentioned, being arrested on suspicion of murder in Ireland is not the same as being arrested for murder. After being detained for 24 hours, the suspect was released without charge, and nothing of evidentiary value was found during the search of the property in Clondalkin. The Gardaí now believes that Annie was killed on the same day she went missing, and the sightings of her at the pub in Enniskerry were probably false. But there does seem to be progress in the investigation, and I'll keep you apprised of any further updates. The other Vanishing Triangle case which has had movement this year is the disappearance of 25-year-old Fiona Pender, who was 7 months pregnant and living with her boyfriend John Thompson at their apartment in the town of Tullamore. John claimed that on the morning of August 23, 1996, he left to go to work at his family's farm and last saw Fiona sleeping in bed, but she soon vanished without a trace. Later that evening, an eyewitness claimed that they saw two men carrying what appeared to be a rolled-up carpet outside Fiona's apartment before placing it in the back of a 4x4 vehicle, and sometime after that, another witness reported seeing a 4x4 being driven on a remote road in the Sleeve Bloom Mountains. In 1997, a man described as being the prime suspect was detained by the Gardaí for questioning alongside his three sisters and their father. While no charges were filed and the prime suspect has never been named publicly, it's heavily implied that the suspect is John Thompson, and the Gardaí believes that he killed Fiona and his family helped cover the whole thing up. In May of 2008, a makeshift wooden cross suddenly appeared on a trail in the Sleeve Bloom Mountains featuring the words, quote, Fiona Pender, buried here, August the 22nd, 1996, end quote. Well, in May of this past year, the Gardaí began performing searches on a section of land in the Sleeve Bloom Mountains near the village of Clunisley in County Laois, and this was reportedly the same area where the cross was discovered. They also did a separate search of an area of farmland located near the village of Kelly in County Offaly. An anonymous source has told the media that these searches came about after a witness with key knowledge of the relationship between Fiona and the prime suspect came forward with what was described as, quote-unquote, credible and highly significant information about the circumstances of her disappearance. While the Gardaí have not shared any information about the results of these searches, they did confirm that the case has been upgraded from a missing persons investigation to a murder inquiry. Well, the prime suspect relocated to the Canadian province of Saskatchewan many years ago, and in 2014, he was charged with sexually assaulting and threatening to kill his wife. But when he went on trial, the Chief Justice did not believe that there was sufficient evidence to prove the allegations against him, so he was found not guilty on all charges. As far as I can tell, the suspect is still living in Canada, but the Gardaí have said that they cannot seek his extradition to Ireland without firm evidence of his involvement in Fiona's death, and her remains have still never been found. It now seems more obvious than ever that Fiona's disappearance has no connection to any of the other Vanishing Triangle cases and was likely a personal crime committed by someone she knew. Regardless, I'm glad to see that there is active movement on this case, and perhaps we will see a resolution at some point. And while we're on the subject of recent searches being performed for missing victims, let's briefly discuss the disappearance of 13-year-old Lee Ochi, which I covered on Minisode number 20. On August 27, 1992, Lee disappeared from her home in Tupelo, Mississippi, while Hurricane Andrew was taking place, and since pools of blood were found there, the evidence strongly suggested that Lee had become the victim of foul play. Lee's mother, Vicki Felton, claimed that she had gone to work that morning and attempted to phone Lee from there, but when she failed to answer the phone, Vicki immediately rushed back home and discovered that her daughter was missing. While Vicki has always believed that Lee was abducted by an intruder, she has taken 3 separate lie detector tests which have shown signs of deception, so law enforcement still consider Vicki to be a person of interest. Well, on January the 29th of this year, the Tupelo Police Department, the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Unit, and the FBI all teamed together to perform a search of an area near Lee's former residence on Honey Locust Drive. We have no idea if any evidence was found, as the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation simply stated, quote, while findings from the search cannot be disclosed at this time, investigators remain committed to following all leads and gathering information related to the case. No further comments will be made at this time, end quote. However, one of the experts who searched the property was Jesse Goliath, a forensic anthropologist from Mississippi State University, and while he could not comment on whether anything was found, he did confirm that investigators believe that Lee's body is still on the property where she once lived. There isn't much else to report here, but it seems clear that law enforcement has their own ideas about what happened and will continue actively working on this case. So now I want to talk about a missing persons case that I've discussed numerous times on previous update episodes, and that's the disappearance of 17-year-old Tracy Crow, which I covered alongside 2 other missing persons cases on episode number 89. On August 5, 1989, Tracy went missing after leaving her home in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, and her abandoned car was discovered in the town square in Millersburg. There's been a number of odd twists and turns in this case these past several years, the first of which took place in August of 2019, when 54-year-old Matthew Webster was named as a person of interest after he was charged with perjury. I don't want to repeat myself too much, so if you want to learn more details about this development, I'd recommend listening to my previous update episodes, but long story short, after Webster entered a plea of no contest to the charge, he received a sentence of 4.5 to 12 months in prison. But it seems like Webster is no longer the focal point of the investigation, as in May of 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police named an 89-year-old Jackson Township man named Mark Eugene Warfel as a suspect in Tracy's case. In spite of Warfel's advanced age, he has continued to have troubles with the law in recent years and has been arrested on numerous charges such as burglary, trespassing, stalking, harassment, indecent assault, and aggravated assault. The last time we mentioned Warfel on an update episode, he was incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Laurel Highlands since he was suffering from dementia and the prison offers specialized care for elderly inmates. Investigators have learned that Warfel was friends with Tracy's parents at the time of her disappearance and worked alongside her father. But the most surprising revelation was that Warfel once had an affair with Tracy's mother and was actually the biological father of Tracy's younger sister, Kim Masser. Kim has visited Warfel at the prison hospital on multiple occasions and secretly recorded some of their conversations, where Warfel has denied any involvement in Tracy's disappearance and claims she was killed by a married man named Kenny after she rebuffed his attempts to have a relationship with her. Well, in May of this past year, the Pennsylvania State Police performed a new search of a property which once belonged to Warfel and was located on Mountain House Road in the Halifax borough. They do not officially confirm if the search was related to Tracy's case, only that they were there for a quote-unquote police investigation / follow-up. 3 months later, on September the 11th, Warfel died of natural causes in the prison hospital at the age of 92. His death took place just as arrangements were being made to transfer him to a long-term care facility, but investigators still believe he was responsible for Tracy's disappearance, even though they lack the evidence to file charges. It's always sad when suspects in missing persons cases die without revealing the truth about what happened to the victim. At this particular point, we don't know the full contents of Warfel's recorded conversations with Kim Masser, and while the authorities believe he made some significant statements about Tracy's case, this is obviously complicated by the fact that he was suffering from dementia. All we know for certain is that Tracy is still missing after more than 36 years, but hopefully, the newfound attention that her case has received in recent years might eventually lead to a resolution someday. So now we're going to move on to some cases we've discussed in previous update episodes where a suspect had been arrested but had yet to go on trial for the crime. And at long last, I can finally announce a resolution in a case which I've been discussing for quite some time, and that's the murder of 51-year-old Roger Dean, which was featured on episode number 128. On November the 21st, 1985, Roger was shot to death at a suburban residence in Littleton, Colorado, in what appeared to be a botched attempt at a kidnapping / robbery. The perpetrator was a male intruder who wore a ski mask and left it behind when he fled the scene, but investigators eventually used genetic genealogy to link DNA from the mask to a 64-year-old suspect named Michael Jefferson. Jefferson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted kidnapping in April of 2021, but for the next 3 years, there was pretty much a media blackout in this case, as no new information was released to the public, and I had no idea when Jefferson was scheduled to go on trial. However, in July of 2024, it was announced that the investigation had been tainted by a scandal involving Yvonne Missy Woods, who had been employed by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's crime lab as a forensic analyst and worked on a number of cases, including this one. It turned out that Woods had been manipulating and tampering with DNA evidence in many of these cases, which now put the results of the testing into question and made me wonder if Michael Jefferson might actually be an innocent man. In spite of this, the authorities remained convinced that Jefferson was the right guy, But since there was fear that this scandal could potentially taint their case if they took him to trial and provide reasonable doubt for a jury, Douglas County prosecutors agreed to a plea deal last August in which Jefferson would plead guilty to the lesser crime of conspiracy to commit murder, and the other charges against him would be dropped. Ever since I saw this case profiled on Unsolved Mysteries many years ago, I always had a ton of questions about it, as the show pushed forward the possibility that Roger was working in unison with the masked intruder in order to orchestrate some sort of scheme involving a staged kidnapping, but then things went horribly wrong and Roger was fatally shot. However, it now seems apparent that Jefferson committed the crime on his own and Roger was a completely innocent victim. If you watch the Unsolved Mystery segment, you'll know that 5 years after Roger's murder took place, an unidentified caller attempted to extort his widow, DJ Dean, by threatening to kill her and her daughter if she did not pay him $100,000 in cash. At the time, it was uncertain if the extortionist was Roger's killer or someone else who was attempting to cash in on the tragedy, but since the statute of limitations for those particular crimes have long expired, no one was ever going to be charged for them, though it sounds like the authorities are now pretty convinced that Jefferson was behind the extortion attempt. But in a sad twist of fate, DJ Dean died by suicide in August of 2020 at the age of 84, only 6 months before her husband's killer was finally brought to justice. What's particularly frustrating about this plea deal is that Jefferson has not admitted any culpability in his crime, as his defense attorney is still proclaiming Jefferson's innocence and insisting that he reluctantly agreed to the deal over fears that he might be convicted at trial and receive a much harsher sentence. But unfortunately, the lack of a trial means that the public may never learn the full story about what happened. On January the 16th of this year, Jefferson's sentencing hearing took place in Douglas County Circuit Court, and the judge gave him the maximum sentence of 32 years. Of course, since Jefferson was 67 years old at that point, this was essentially a life sentence, but he will be eligible for parole after serving as little as 8 years. Roger and DJ's daughter, Tamara Dean Harney, made a victim impact statement in the courtroom in which she said, quote, "Given the trial delays and the debacle with the recent DNA scandal, I think it's a good thing Mom wasn't here to witness this. If she wasn't already dead, this process would have killed her." End quote. Another individual who appeared in court for Jefferson's sentencing was Carly Gibson, a former neighbor of the Deans who was 9 years old when the crime took place. If you've heard my original episode, you might recall that Carly told the original investigators that she looked out her bedroom window and saw a black man fleeing the scene before he climbed into a car and drove away. The authorities attempted to reenact the situation by looking down at a white police officer running past Carly's bedroom window, and they claimed that from their perspective, the officer looked dark-skinned while walking past some bright white snow. Therefore, they figured that Carly was mistaken, and if you watch the Unsolved Mystery segment, investigators described the perpetrator as being a white male, and he was even played by a white actor during the reenactments. However, since Michael Jefferson is black, it turns out that Carly was right all along, and when she appeared at the sentencing hearing, I hope she uttered the words, "I told you so." Well, an important piece of information which was not shared publicly until this year was that in the weeks following Jefferson's arrest in 2021, a woman called a tip line to inform the authorities that she had worked with Roger back in 1985 and also happened to be Jefferson's girlfriend at that time. It now seems apparent that this is how Jefferson learned about Roger in the first place and got the idea to attempt a robbery at his house. If you're wondering why this woman didn't come forward much earlier, well, that's because investigators spent over 35 years telling everyone that the killer was a white man, so she probably had no inkling that Jefferson might be a suspect. If they had listened to Carly Gibson and told the public that the perpetrator was a black man from the start, then perhaps Jefferson's girlfriend would have put two and two together and come forward much sooner. So yes, this is a very unsatisfying and anticlimactic resolution, but since Jefferson has still not taken any responsibilities for his actions, I don't think the odds of him receiving parole are very high, and he will likely remain behind bars for the rest of his life. So now let's discuss a case where the defendant's trial recently got started before it came to an abrupt halt. I covered the murders of 66-year-old Harold Swain and his 63-year-old wife, Thelma Swain, which was also featured on one of the earliest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. The Swains were an African-American couple, and Harold was the deacon at the Rising Daughters Baptist Church in Waverly, Georgia, but on the evening of March the 11th, 1985, they were both shot in the church's vestibule by a white man who left a pair of eyeglasses behind at the scene. I've discussed this case a lot on previous update episodes, but long story short, a suspect named Dennis Perry was convicted of both murders in 2003 and received 2 consecutive life sentences, but when DNA testing was performed on a pair of hairs which were found in the hinges of the killer's eyeglasses, they did not match Perry and put his conviction into question. At one point, this case was featured on a season of the Undisclosed podcast, and I was invited to be a guest on one of their addendum episodes alongside Colin Miller and Susan Simpson. Well, in July of 2020, Perry's murder conviction was vacated, and he was released from prison after serving 17 years for a crime he did not commit. The new investigation led to a very compelling alternate suspect named Eric Sparr, an alleged white supremacist who had a history of making racist comments and reportedly bragged to multiple people about having murdered the Swains. After a hair sample was obtained from Sparr's mother, mitochondrial DNA testing showed that it matched the hairs from the killer's eyeglasses, which meant that they belonged to someone who was related to her. However, even though Sparr became the new prime suspect, it would not be until December 9, 2024, when he was finally arrested by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and charged with 2 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Well, 2 months ago, Sparr's trial began in Brunswick Judicial Court on October the 28th, and immediately featured a new revelation when Sparr's former brother-in-law testified that he had given a cassette recording to the Camden County Sheriff's Office in 1987. The recording supposedly featured audio of Sparr admitting that he was the person who, quote-unquote, killed those people, and he then threatened his brother-in-law by stating, quote, I killed them and I'll kill you next. However, it wasn't long before controversy ensued, as another witness spoke out of turn by testifying about a past relationship he had with Sparr. So, only one day after the trial began, Brunswick Judicial Circuit Chief Judge Stephen Scarlett felt he had no choice but to declare a mistrial, stating that this decision resulted from the quote-unquote violation of a pretrial order restricting witnesses from testifying about information unrelated to the charges against Mr. Sparr. The jury was sent home, and we are now back to square one, as at the moment, no new trial date for Sparr has been set. However, I wanted to mention that a few months ago, I obtained a copy of a new book about this case titled The Man No One Believed, The Untold Story of the Georgia Church Murders, which was written by Joshua Sharp, a reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who provided a ton of coverage about this case. A new piece of information I learned from this book is that Eric Sparr's son, David Sparr, is a notorious murderer known as the Craigslist Killer, and he is currently on death row after being convicted of the first-degree murder of 21-year-old Tiara Poole, which took place in Jacksonville, Florida on July the 12th, 2010. At the time, Poole was the mother of 2 young sons, and her husband was serving in the Navy, but since he was deployed at sea, she decided to post an ad on Craigslist looking for sex. The ad would be answered by David Sparr, who was only 19 years old at the time, and after he showed up at Poole's apartment and had sex with her, he proceeded to stab her with a kitchen knife 89 times, and he would later say that he simply did it for the quote-unquote rush. So yeah, even though Eric Sparr is technically not a convicted murderer yet, it sounds like the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree in this family. So we have 3 more Trailwind cold cases to discuss where a suspect has been arrested for the crime, but their trial has not yet taken place. One of them is the murder of 6-year-old Jeremy Stoner, who was abducted from Vallejo, California on February the 21st, 1987, before he was sodomized, stabbed to death, and dumped into a remote area of Sacramento County. I covered this case on episode number 324, but in September of 2023, a 69-year-old Oregon resident named Fred Marion Kane III was arrested on the charges of murder with special circumstances with respect to kidnapping, sodomy, and a lewd act on a child after he was linked to the crime via DNA evidence. The last time I reported on this case, Kane had entered a plea of not guilty, but there have not been any new updates since then. As far as I can tell, a trial date has not yet been set, but per usual, I'll keep you posted about when it finally happens. Our next case is the murder of 36-year-old Byron Carr, who was strangled with a towel and stabbed with a kitchen knife at his home in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island on November the 12th, 1988. I covered this case on episode number 281, and in January of 2024, a 56-year-old suspect named Todd Joseph Gallant was arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of interfering with human remains. And of course, this arrest was made possible when a DNA profile was created for Byron's killer and uploaded to some genealogy websites which matched Gallant's relatives and eventually paved the way for his identification. The only new developments I have to report since my last update episode are that Gallant has pleaded not guilty to the murder, and his defense attorney has challenged the admissibility of the DNA evidence, alleging that it violated Gallant's rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Back in October, a voir dire about this issue was held before Chief Justice Tracy Clements in the Supreme Court of Prince Edward Island, but no further information has been shared publicly. I'm guessing that we'll need the issue with the DNA to be resolved before a trial date can be set for Gallant, but once he receives one, I'll be sure to let you know. And last but not least, here's the case in which we've been waiting nearly 7 years for the prime suspect to go on trial. Way back on minisode number 22, I covered the disappearance of 28-year-old Danny Stizlicki, who vanished after leaving her workplace in Southfield, Michigan on December the 2nd, 2016. And appropriately enough, this also happened to be on the same minisode as the disappearance of Paige Ronkowski, which I discussed earlier. Well, even though I have talked about this case on nearly every single one of our update episodes, we still don't have a conclusion. Well, Danny's remains have still not been found. A suspect named Floyd Galloway, who worked as a security guard at her workplace, was charged with premeditated first-degree murder in March of 2019, but his trial has been delayed on numerous occasions. When the murder charge was filed against Galloway, he was already serving a 16 to 35-year prison sentence for an unrelated attack and attempted sexual assault on another woman, so he has been behind bars the entire time. However, even though the evidence against Galloway in Danny's case seemed to be overwhelming, the case hit a major snag in November of 2022 when a circuit court judge ruled that some of the evidence the authorities had collected from Galloway's home, including Danny's keys and her Fitbit, would have to be suppressed at his murder trial. The issue was that the search warrants used to obtain this evidence were based on information gathered from a private polygraph test, which was arranged by Galloway's defense attorney. And since the polygraph examiner proceeded to share the information from this test with the police, this technically violated attorney-client privilege and Galloway's due process rights. As you can imagine, the situation has created a lot of behind-the-scenes drama and is the main reason why Galloway's trial has yet to take place, but even though a lot of the evidence gathered against him can no longer be used, the state still believes they have a strong enough case against him to secure a conviction. At the time of this recording, Galloway's trial is scheduled to begin just over 1 month from now, on February the 2nd, 2026, and hopefully, after nearly a decade, we will finally have a resolution. And of course, I'm sure we'll be talking about this on our next update episode. Anyway, that about brings an end to this update episode. That was certainly quite a long one, but when you've got this much material to discuss about resolutions and developments in cold cases, that can only be a good thing, and I know we'll be releasing more update episodes just like this one in the future. If you would like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7.5 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode on a story from Unsolved Mysteries about a mysterious figure who was supposedly responsible for starting a series of fires in Washington state and causing the death of a firefighter, the King of Arsonists. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1984 murder of Mark Rosinger. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Adam M., Zachary S., Stella G., Jeanette N., and Sky L. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, it bears repeating how awesome it is that we've been doing this podcast for nearly 10 years now, and our featured cases have now generated enough material for no less than 7 update episodes, as we are living in a great time for solving cold cases. So I hope you all have a happy new year and join us next Wednesday, or should I say next year, as we return to our regular format and present 2026 first episode of The Trail Went Cold.